Hello.
Our story begins in the arena on Geonosis. The echoes of battle can be heard outside the Tomb of Dead Jedi, Geonosians, battle droids, one clone, and Jango Fett. His son Boba was sitting not far from his body, holding onto a helmet that his father once wore with pride. The unclone didn't know what to do anymore. It wasn't more than 20 minutes before when he watched a Jedi Master decapitate his father. It felt like days had passed since that moment. The galaxy came to a stop and he was here, alone. He held the helmet looking into his expressionless gaze, trying to piece together what would become of his life now. Boba looked around and then to the sky, as the sound of gunships, all too familiar, buzzed overhead. He never thought he would ever resent the hum of an LAAT like he did now. Boba got to his feet and took his father's helmet back to the ship. Inside of it were a set of custom pistols and armor that Boba was supposed to wear one day. It was inside Slave 1, where he was safe from the war unfolding on the surface of the planet. It was here inside of his father's vessel that he would try and come up with a plan to escape from this hell he found himself in. Boba remembered some of the many conversations he and his father had, things to do if he ever died in combat or on a mission. But the issue is, Boba was only given these instructions for when he was on Kamino, not in the circumstance that Jango died with Boba by his side, because Jango never intended for that to happen. He looked into the ship's manifest to see what he could find, if he could find anything his father may have left behind. Perhaps there were close friends or allies that he could acquaint himself with. Boba was already trained for the life of a bounty hunter. He wasn't trained to become one, but he was trained so that he could always protect himself in case it was necessary. At his heart, Boba wanted to go right into the lifestyle that killed his father, but he was unsure if that was even the right decision. He met with a couple people before but never remembered their names. He just thought that they were a fascinating group of people and continued with his life. Boba always believed that he would live to adulthood and be able to make a choice with his life with the guidance of his father around him. Now that that wasn't the case, he needed to make a decision for himself. Boba scoured the manifest for hours and came across a number of languages that he didn't know or speak. He could identify a couple syllables or letters, but that was about it. Though one thing was most apparent about these symbols is that they all originated from Mandalore. Boba couldn't remember much about what his father said regarding the Mandalorians. Jango definitely had his own issues with the people of Mandalore, most specifically those from Death Watch. However, Jango made a point to leave his past behind him. He was in the top 1% of Mandalorian warriors in his era, so there was never really any concern for him when it came to challengers from Mandalore. Because Jango left so many stories about his time with the Mandalorians behind him, Boba wasn't entirely sure if they could be trusted or not. He was hopeful that they could be. The biggest reason for this is because his father wore Mandalorian armor. He assumed that because Jango wore the armor, his father and he himself would be accepted amongst the warriors or clans of Mandalore. What Boba was able to read was in regard to a moon of Mandalore. He couldn't read much else about why there was such an importance to Concordia. Since he knew his father had marked Concordia, he decided that he would go there first. Boba didn't know anything about Mandalorian politics. Most of his life revolved around regiments his father gave him, and the very little taste of maternity he felt from Taun We. Boba was never bothered by that, at least not on the surface, and so he set out to find his belonging. Boba did make a trip to a local fueling depot in the Outer Rim. He went directly to the Anrandia refueling depot. It wasn't much more than a short jump from Nal Hutta, which was close enough to Geonosis that he could get there with what little he had left. Boba was also kind of hoping that his father's ship might be recognized by an ally. When he landed on Anrandia, it turns out his father made an enemy or two there, and so Boba was going to pay for what his dead daddy couldn't. This led to Boba spending about a week on the system avoiding gangsters, before dispatching each of them and escaping inside Slave 1. This extra week really heightened Boba's awareness to the galaxy around him. It made him almost wish he went to some of the smugglers or bounty hunters' dens that were closer to Geonosis. If he went the bounty hunting route, then he wouldn't have been anywhere near Anrandia. But it was a whatever thing. It just made him yearn for friendship more. If he could get allies, then he would be a lot safer. Ironically, if Jango hadn't instilled into Boba that he and the clones weren't alike, Boba would have had a much easier time going to them. It was one of those things that Boba didn't know any better for. Jango told his son that he was a legitimate heir to his name. The clones were not the same. They had the genetic enhancements, such as aging or mutations or whatnot. Boba didn't. And while this was true, aside from Omega running around Tipoca City, the clones would have accepted Boba had he gone back to Kamino. They would have treated him like a brother and taken care of him. The obvious risk is becoming a lab rat to hang around Nala Se all the time. But none of that crossed his mind. The clones were lesser beings than him. Boba didn't hate them or dislike them, he just saw himself on a pedestal in comparison to them because of Jango. Regardless, Boba exited hyperspace outside the Mandalorian moon of Concordia. He piloted the ship down for what the coordinates were next to the words he could decipher. Boba had no issue finding an old mine and landing. He didn't really know why there wasn't anyone around here, but he grabbed some Mandalorian armor that fit and put it on. He grabbed one of the pistols his father had pre-made for him and exited the vessel. Boba had his weapons ready just in case anyone came across him. The issue for him at the moment is that his father's helmet was too large for his head, so he was basically wearing an oversized chest piece with his father's shoulder pads, hoping that the armor would be recognizable. He was very excited, walking through the mines, preparing to meet those that he would soon call home. As he walked through, a couple shadows dropped behind him, but he didn't notice. He continued to look around for anyone until seeing an empty assembly room. He looked around before making his way towards a lift and taking it up. The two shadows behind him informed the commander of what was going on. Boba exited at the top of the elevator and looked down at a small camp. He was surprised that everything was so small. He truthfully expected more from the Mandalorians. He was a little disappointed, but instead of pouting about it, he looked for a way down. As Boba started to walk around the top layer of the camp, the two that had been trailing him popped up behind him and grabbed his arms, pulling him back and holding him steady. At 10 years old, there wasn't really much he could do. A jetpack sounded off, and then the man who landed in front of him was clearly a leader of some sorts. Pre Vizsla asked the boy who he was and why he was here. Boba told him that he was Boba Fett, son of Jango, and he came here because his father had this planet or moon inside the manifest of the ship. Pre looked to the other Mandalorians and removed his helmet with an insidious grin. He told the boy that he wasn't welcome here. He laughed as he said it, looking around and telling the child that Jango wasn't welcome within the Death Watch. Boba was extremely confused, and Pre turned around and told the kid that he was foolish for coming here. His father was even more so for believing that he could just be cloned and act like a Mandalorian. Pre got down on the Boba's level and smiled with a devious grin, and told Boba that Jango wasn't a real Mandalorian. True Mandalorians were born in the Mandalore system. Concord Dawn wasn't Mandalorian, and neither were the Fetts. Pre pulled his pistol and spun it around in his fingers, asking the other Mandalorians how they should execute the Faker. Boba squirmed, pulling at his arms, trying to break free, and Pre spun the pistol and placed it against Boba's head and smiled. He asked the kid if he had any last words. Boba panicked, but he was grateful his father taught him a trick. So, Boba threw his knee upwards, and a small rocket bounced out of his knee and slammed right into Pre Vizsla's codpiece. The Death Watch leader toppled over in terrible pain, as Boba pulled at his arms, feeling the grip on the left side slip. He didn't try to stay and fight. He knew at this point he wasn't a match, so he ran towards the lift and pulled a pistol, shot the lining at the top of the lift, and watched it drop. Behind him, the other Mandalorians were starting to take notice. They fired away at him, and he jumped into the hole. Because Boba was simply trying to impress the Mandalorians, he had equipment all over him. He pulled some detonators out of his pockets and threw them at the ground underneath him as he scurried away. He knew he'd never be able to escape the Mandalorians on foot, so he needed to even the odds. The boy ran out of the mines and into his father's ship before lifting off and pulling away from the moon. As he did, he was chased by Mandalorian starcraft. Pre really wanted him dead and was willing to risk anything he had to get Boba's head on a platter. 3 fighters chased after him, and Boba very quickly had to use all of his father's training to his advantage, but he hadn't piloted and fired away at the same time. Plus, it was extremely hard with short arms. Boba pulled back and forth, avoiding fire from the Mandalorian vessels. In his panic, he started for Mandalore itself, which was slightly troubling because he assumed more Mandalorians meant more trouble for him. Boba couldn't avoid these chasers as he spun and maneuvered as best as he could. He was getting distance and he dropped 2 seismic charges, but he was mistimed, and due to the one they used over Geonosis, the ship was out of them. The bombs didn't hit the mark, and so he twisted the lasers on the front of the ship backwards and fired away. One of the ships was knocked out of the air before the side of Slave 1 was clipped and sped down towards the surface of Mandalore. He continued firing away, strafing one of the fighters before descending to the surface of the planet with very little control. When he entered the atmosphere, he smashed through another Mandalorian ship before the last one broke off, and it was the last thing he remembered. When Boba woke up, he was inside of a medical facility. He was surrounded by people who were taking care of him. There was a notice next to his bed, and it was written in Galactic Standard, so he could actually read it. He was requested to the Palace of Sundari when he was healthy enough to walk on his own. It would take a couple of hours, but Boba only had a mild concussion from his crash. There was a bruised fibula on his left leg, but it wasn't too bad. He eventually got to the palace and was amazed by its wondrous size and beauty. At the end of the throne room was an elegant woman. Next to her, at the bottom of a few steps, was a ghastly figure. Boba approached, being escorted by some Mandalorian guards. There was an introduction process, and when he disclosed his name, Almec turned to the Duchess and told her that he needed to be done away with. Fett wasn't a Mandalorian, nothing more than a terrorist. Boba was visibly upset by this. At this point, everyone in the galaxy was aware that the clone army was Jango Fett's clones. They also knew that the infamous bounty hunter was killed on Geonosis, something reported by now Jedi General Mace Windu. Almec referred to Boba as a clone of a terrible person who tried to claim his name to Mandalore, and with a whip of her fingers, she shushed him. Satine may have disagreed with Jango's lifestyle, but under his hobbies and professions was an honorable man. She told Almec to do away with himself, essentially, as she stepped off her throne and asked to speak with Boba alone. The two of them were going to walk through Sundari. She wanted to get an idea of why he was here and how he was doing, a task that would be impossible with Almec bugging the two of them. Satine and Jango never crossed paths, personally, but they knew of each other. Neither disliked or liked the other. It was more so of a respect for their own decisions in life. Jango, by the time Satine really took power, didn't care enough about Mandalore. Plus, he hated Death Watch. She knew of his talents and was totally against his way of life, for the sake of her people, but she respected his honor. This is where she differed from Almec. Jango may have not been a Mandalorian, but certain groups were more than willing to accept foundlings. Satine and this society was one of them. It was an elitist way of life to perceive someone as lesser due to being born elsewhere. Satine and Boba had a long talk with each other. She explained that he had done damage to one of their landing docks, but she wasn't going to blame him for it. Boba explained that there was something called Death Watch and they were on Concordia, even explaining who their leader was by describing his face, which gave her insight into who her friends and enemies were. The two of them talked for hours, stopping in a park and discussing Boba's trajectory in life. He wanted revenge, but she discouraged it. Truthfully, she had a tough decision to make regarding Death Watch, especially since she knew that Pre Vizsla was their leader. She wanted to keep the peace, but Mandalorians existed in spite of themselves. It was a tragic cycle that she didn't want to be repeated. But honestly, Pre wasn't bold enough to target Sundari without help, which he didn't have at the moment. So in this moment, with Boba, she was most concerned for him and if he would be alright. She could see that the pressure of being an adult at 10 was weighing him down, and she could sympathize with that. It wasn't easy. She had lived that life before. Satine gave her stories to him, hoping to inspire him, hoping to give him hope in himself. She didn't want to leave him alone, especially because he had no one else and his ship was damaged. While they were speaking, it became evident to her that he was intent on finding a way to get revenge, and he was very focused on what would potentially be a life full of pain and suffering. She could very clearly see the pain in his eyes, especially whenever the conversation found its way back to his father. She knew he was a clone, but unlike Almec, she never referred to him as one. Satine saw Boba as his own individual, just as she believed all the clones were. So instead of allowing Boba to boil in his own pain, she told him at the end of their conversation that if he wanted, he could have his own room inside the royal palace for however long he wanted. She started to explain that she wouldn't be able to be there for him all the time or anything, and before she could finish, he wrapped his arms around her. He was conflicted, and she was giving him the only sense of comfort he had received since his father died. Also, it wasn't like he'd experienced anything maternal before. Tanwi wasn't exactly the most caring individual. Neither were any of the Kaminoans. She was very surprised, but she lowered her arms behind his back and then brought him back to the palace. She of course needed to make her own decision regarding how she would handle the Death Watch, but the light in Boba's eyes gave her hope that there wouldn't be need for a conflict. The following few months would be full of tough decisions and ramping up their police force and royal guard. Satine had embraced a mother-like role with Boba, and she'd opened herself up for the first time since she was last around Ben Kenobi. She hadn't ever experienced this before, aside for a few times with her nephew. Satine showed Boba her Mandalorian armor and told him stories about her own father, which encouraged him to tell stories about Jango. The heal was to embrace, to remember but not lament. She told Boba that his father wouldn't want him to suffer over his loss. Jango and her may have disagreed on morals, but his honor told her everything she needed to know about him and the boy he raised. Boba appreciated her warmth more than words could say. Most of their days weren't around each other. Boba was able to frolic around the palace or go to school if he wanted. To keep up the ruse in school so that he wouldn't be bullied for being a Fett, he called himself Boba Kryze. He didn't mind this, and he appreciated that she was willing to do that for him. He did understand how busy she was, too, especially with the worry of Death Watch, so he never took up issue with her being so active and away from him. But Satine always made a point to eat dinner with him. Didn't matter if she had dinner with diplomats beforehand, she'd always save room so that she could sit down with him and eat, asking him about his day, his new adventures, times with new friends, and whatever else was running rampant in his mind. This was hard for her. It did involve her physically pushing herself to stay up later in some circumstances, and have more patience on difficult days. but the peace it gave Boba was worth all of it. The thing with Boba, being 10 years old, is that he was searching for a connection. He was searching for someone to be around, and because he didn't go to the Bounty Hunters Guild, he found his only sense of belonging with Satine, which is why he stayed. His father's ship was repaired, and because he was so adamant on being Mandalorian like his father, she brought him to the Great Forge, where he'd have his own armor. It would be resized in the future, but he was permitted to get it, ceremonially. Mandalorians still used the Forge, but just not as ritualistically as they once did. The previous Civil War kinda took it out of the society. This moment in the Great Forge came months after Boba came to Mandalore, and because Satine had kept a close eye on Boba, she accidentally found some drawings he made on the tablet. He fell asleep in the living quarters of the palace, and she was cleaning up and putting a blanket over him when she saw it. He made an emblem for himself. It combined Jango Fett's personal symbol and that of Clan Kryze. She thought it was endearing, and so as Boba was having his armor crafted, she presented him with a cutout piece of what he drew. It could forever be a part of his armor, and Boba didn't really have the words or emotions to properly express anything. He originally planned on leaving Mandalore, but now he knew he found his home. For Satine, she simply got joy out of him having what could best be described as a normal childhood. Boba was now not just a part of his father's legacy, but that of an adopted family's legacy. In wearing her armor again for the ceremony, Satine knew what needed to be done. As a little girl, she desired to be a warrior like her father. As an adult, she needed to be a leader for her people because this is what they wanted. However, because she was monitoring Concordia, she could see that Death Watch was amping up their movements and their supply runs. She knew that at one point or another they'd prepare for an attack, and then she saw Separatist tanks, and with that, she had to make a decision. Luckily, the way she planned it out, she could use those Separatist tanks against Death Watch. Because they weren't associated with Mandalore, a local Republic fleet was able to deal with not just the CIS forces, but the Mandalorians on the surface. As Death Watch hobbled away, they were captured by the Mandalorian Royal Guard and police force from Sundari. The miniature war was anticlimactic, entirely because Satine didn't want another war to top Sundari. Kaldabe was the cost of the previous civil war on Mandalore. She didn't want Death Watch to even have a chance. She was able to acquire the Darksaber when she accompanied the guard to capture Death Watch. There was little conflict, and it resulted in the remaining members of Death Watch being placed behind bars. Satine took the Mandalorian weapon to where it belonged, in the hands of their people. It was a part of their history, and so it was enclosed inside of a learning center, so that it could be treasured by their people for generations to come. Aside from this little hiccup on Concordia, the Clone Wars stayed far, far away from Mandalore. There were some plots to dethrone Satine, but she remained as a powerful leader for the Neutral Systems Coalition. Dooku and Palpatine hated her because she was able to resist the temptation to join either faction, and her unbreakable will kept her out of the hands of violent mercenaries and assassins. The one true threat to her power, that would have been Darth Maul, was never recovered. He and his brother were left adrift, locked in a frozen abyss until one day they crashed down into a star. Satine and Ben had a couple of small reunions during the war, but none lasting too long. This was something that Satine helped Boba with. He initially hated the Jedi, and she was willing to hear him out, and then she explained Mandalorian history, how once the Jedi and Mandalorians warred with each other. Vizsla still believed the Jedi were evil and whatnot, but what was amazing is that with time, wounds can mend. They can become whole again. Maybe he didn't want to forgive or forget, and she wouldn't blame him, but perhaps there would be a day, one when he least expects it, that the Jedi would be an aid to him. He never thought of it like that, and with her own personal understanding and experiences with the Jedi and Obi-Wan, he was able to see them in a different light. This didn't make Boba understanding or respectful in his thoughts surrounding Windu, but it did help his upset heart. Before the end of the Clone Wars, Boba was calling Satine Bir, which in the Mandalorian language meant either mother or father, in this case mother. She would sometimes refer to him as Ad, because that was a used word for son or daughter, again in this case being son. Their dynamic was very sweet, and the people accepted Boba as one of Clan Kryze. Obviously using her name helped with this, but he was able to grow up into someone who could represent Clan Kryze with the prowess of a Kryze, but not just that, the prowess of a Fett. Because Boba wanted to keep some of his warrior way alive, he did spend some time with the Royal Guard in their training, but most of his time actually was spent at school with other Mandalorians. Something else that happened before the end of the war was the reunion between sisters. Bo and Satine had been separated for years. It all came after the Civil War. Satine hated that things happened the way they did, but there wasn't anything they could do to change the past. Instead, what they could do was fix themselves in the present. The rekindling of sisterhood was everything to Satine. The Duchess didn't want Deathwatch to be resentful, and she tried to help them out of their ways. They could be productive as guardsmen or enforcers, but they rejected it. Bo came back around because she realized how great of a leader her sister was. Mandalore had fully recovered from a civil war and was on the galactic stage as a world of strength and prosperity. But Mandalore was about to face its most challenging era. With the execution of Order 66, Satine had to navigate the difficulty of an Imperial reign. The CIS vanished from the galactic map overnight, as did the Jedi, which broke Satine's heart. It was the second time she thought Obi-Wan died. Also, why did he lie to her the first time? Anyways, due to Order 66 and her worry for Ben, she was able to get into contact with him. She was friends with Padme, and of course, there was a bond with Obi-Wan. What resulted when she finally learned that he was alive, of course, was Obi-Wan, Luke, and Leia were brought to Sundari and hidden away within the palace. They would not see the light of day, but at least they would be protected. Because Almec had since been removed from power, there weren't, to her knowledge, any more moles running around the palace, but one could never be too sure. It was a difficult time, and Boba tried to do anything to help his bureau, but she was adamant that he needn't do a thing. As Duchess, it was a burden for her to bear, not for him. He understood, but he didn't want to see her struggle with this. The era of the Empire was strenuous. Satine and the 1200 systems inside the Neutral Systems Coalition had to band together to peacefully accept the Empire. As the leader of this coalition, she had to hold relations with the Emperor himself, which was very stressful. He didn't like that she had survived, but he'd have to maintain their current dynamic to keep the status quo. Mandalore had always been an issue in his heart, and he would wait until he could garner some support from the Collective Senate to use anything against her and her people. At the moment, Sidious didn't have that, but he was patient. The rise of the Empire brought the galaxy to what felt like a standstill. Imperial patrols were required everywhere, even systems within the coalition. Satine and her peers couldn't reject it, because if they did, then the Empire would wage war on them, like they did on Mimban. Due to her having to bend at the knee for the Empire, her people became disenchanted with the Emperor. They knew their leader wouldn't just allow the Empire to do that, so they picked the Empire as their enemy. Within the Palace of Sundari, other conversations were being held. Satine was willing to help out Luke and Leia with as much as she could, but she and Ben wouldn't be picking up every aspect of their relationship, due to the fact that she couldn't have the weight of a relationship on her. Also, there was another reason. Both Obi-Wan and Satine acknowledged that with her having to work close around the Emperor, they couldn't risk a couple of things, one of which being a possible pregnancy. Sidious would be all over that, and it would lead the Empire to Mandalore. This was something Satine would not allow to happen to her people. They were finally united. There was no unstable branches of their society, and she wanted to keep it that way. What this meant for Satine and Obi-Wan is that they would play house, if you will. While Kenobi would never leave the palace, to make sure he and the twins were safe, he could raise the twins and interact with Boba. Because Satine accepted Boba, Obi-Wan accepted him, and he saw him as a piece of this little family that they had. It wasn't exactly put together, but it worked for them. Something Obi-Wan didn't expect was what came from his time hanging around with Boba Fett. Boba often went down and asked questions about this, that, or the other. All of it led to Boba seeing the Jedi in yet another different perspective, which for him was very interesting. He enjoyed learning things about things he didn't understand before. He also was very happy to see the effect that Obi-Wan had on Satine. Boba knew from their conversations throughout the Clone Wars that she had been very isolated. Obviously, because she saw him as a son, she didn't tell him everything, but he picked up on some of her emotional reactions and understood why she made the choices she did. She had to isolate herself so that she could protect Mandalore. Boba really got to understand why his bureau was so isolated because of this, but with Obi-Wan she was more open than usual. On the surface, as a ruler, she kept calm and confident in demeanor, but when she was at home with her small little family, she was very content and happy. Bo was always around. Corky was hanging around from time to time. Boba and Obi-Wan got along fine, and the twins were able to grow up with each other and a strong family around them. Satine and Obi-Wan never tied the knot on their relationship, but with him out of the Order, he was able to communicate some of his more personal emotions, though there was something that needed to be noted. Kenobi was able to heal extensively through the bonds he built with Bo-Katan and Boba. For years, the status quo would be maintained on Mandalore. As Satine understood, as long as there were no uprisings like the one from Concordia during the Clone Wars, there wouldn't be any issues. She knew that the Empire was trying to set up Mandalore. Pre Vizsla was freed from prison 1 year and he attempted to start a revolt, before being killed by Bo-Katan and Boba Fett. On top of that, aside from Boba just learning the role of leadership from his bureau, his aunt, Bo, was teaching him some of her methods in the warrior way. It really helped keep everything tighter in the family unit they had. Obi-Wan also did train Boba in some other ways as well. Regardless, the Empire was seemingly trying to find an excuse to balance in the Mandalore, but Satine continued to prevent it. She, on top of that, had begun elevating peers around her. In secrecy, she was aiding Mothma and Organa with the beginning of the Rebel Alliance. Because Satine was more than a senator, she could help out with a lot more support. This was also due to her control and leadership over the Neutral Systems Coalition. This process of keeping Mandalore safe from the Empire while propping up the rebellion was very stressful. The years went by very quickly for her, because she was always winding herself up to make sure she was at the top of her game. The reason her peers were elevated was so in case anything happened to her, they'd be ready to take her responsibilities to ease the transition of power to the heir to the throne, which was Boba. Satine planned everything as extensively as she could. She didn't want anything going wrong for her people or her family, and even though over these several years she was busier than ever before, she'd have the joy of seeing her family evolve. It was something she longed for the 20 years up until Boba's arrival to Mandalore. She and Boba filled a hole in each other's hearts. Boba needed a parent, and Satine needed someone to love. She had dreams of having a family, like the one she had before her parents died and her sister ran away. So despite everything around her and around the galaxy, she always made time for her family. Every day she saw Boba, Luke, and Leia grow up, as well as see the dramatic changes in those who were already adults, or she was close to. Bo, Corky, and Ben all had their own changes within themselves that made them better people for each other in the family. Around 15 years after the execution of Order 66, the Empire sent out fleets to maintain control over a number of other worlds. One of them was Lothal, and another one of them was Mandalore. Satine was not pleased with this, but over the years, legislation continued to push back against the neutral systems. The Imperial military grew without slowing, and no one was able to resist it. This did bug her, but she could handle the Imperial occupation. She did everything she could for her people, while also continuing to contribute to the underground network that had been set up by Bo, Boba, and Ben. Satine shared information with her family in secrecy of the palace. The information was used, especially by Bo and Boba, to go out and help move a section of the path through the Mandalore system. It was just a small portion of it, but the establishment of the path was the building blocks to an underground operation supported by Satine that was ready for when the Empire arrived. On Mandalore, there wasn't a single soul loyal to the Empire, so Satine knew that when they did arrive, her people would be on her side, because she did know, before they ever came this far into the galaxy, that the Empire would try and take over these planets. They were still trying to submit the galaxy to their will, and it would never work. Scare tactics didn't work against those who were determined to take down Tyranny. When the Empire arrived on Mandalore, the people took the occupation in stride. This is when Satine's first left the nest. Boba was given directions from Satine and Bail. He was able to go out and run missions against Imperial stormtroopers. Boba was a powerhouse too. He typically concealed his Mandalorian armor underneath cloth, just to protect Satine and his own name. He would wear his father's helmet though, but because it was just a helmet, no one ever connected it back to Mandalore. There were other mercenaries in the galaxy that wore stolen Mandalorian gear as it was, so it didn't matter. Boba was instrumental in recruiting top-tier members of the rebel insurgent squads. Other Mandalorians did contribute to this, with Bo-Katan being one of them. Though back on Mandalore itself, the Empire started making the Great Forge inaccessible. This did upset a lot of people on Mandalore, because ever since the rise of the Empire, people had been using the Forge to fix and rebuild broken pieces of armor that they didn't use in the 20 years since the Civil War. They were ready for war against the Empire, but Satine specifically wanted to make sure they didn't make a move until the time was right. Throughout this time frame, Obi-Wan was training Luke and Leia. While they knew the truth about their lineage, thanks to Satine encouraging Obi-Wan to tell them, they considered themselves one with Clan Kryze. They knew how to use their lightsabers and they were adequate Force users too. However, they both wanted to be like their older brother, Boba, because of course they considered him their older brother. They missed him while he was out, but he kept in contact with them throughout the entire duration of his time away. While contributing to the rebellions on Ferrix, Aldhani, and Lothal, Mandalore had its own rebellion. Satine worked closely with the Alliance, and used the building of this alliance to anchor her own push to get the Empire away from Mandalore. The Alliance itself was much further along because of the Neutral Systems Coalition. Satine's leadership kept these systems together, and while a few of them left the Coalition to join the Empire, A majority of the 1200 systems were following under Satine, which was following in tandem with the Alliance. When the Empire originally went to Mandalore, it also went to a number of these neutral systems, which were Alliance-based. So, on the day of rebirth, hundreds of star systems, including Mandalore, rose up and took the fight to the Empire. This came after Aldhani, Ferrix, and Lothal. It was a deadly contest, but the Mandalorians, especially, were able to rip through the Imperials. The collective assault pushed the Empire away from a number of these neutral systems. This was the birth of the Rebel Alliance. It was already established, but it was the announcement to the galaxy that the Alliance was real and it was united. This wasn't just rebels, but Jedi, Mandalorians, and anyone else willing to join. The collective uprising was a jarring strike at the Empire, and something that aided this rebellion was the Outer Rim. Without an established criminal empire in the years since the Clone Wars, it was a couple of warring factions without power over the other, which meant that the majority of systems and people were just freely existing without the Empire. These people held resentment for the Empire because it was once the Republic, and when the Empire came for them, they had the motivation to join the fight with the Alliance. It was a domino effect. After Ferrix and Aldhani were Mandalore and Lothal. Following that came Ryloth, Rhodey, and Bothawai. The war only continued from there, but the extra support led to the exposure of secret projects, such as a super weapon over Scarif discovered by Boba Fett. The Alliance was growing, and they used the exposure of the super weapon to bolster support for their movement. The weapon they found was going to be the Death Star, and the realization of what the Empire was trying to accomplish pushed people together. Years would continue by, more warriors funneled out to the front lines, with the likes of Luke and Leia joining their brother, other Jedi, and Mandalorians on the front lines in the fight for the galaxy. The Empire didn't buckle immediately, but when the twins found their father, they fought him, until they both sensed his ability to turn to the light. It wouldn't be for another year or two that they would be able to save Vader. However, he knew that there was no place for him in the galaxy that was to come, so he'd be responsible for bringing balance to the Force by killing the Emperor in a heroic sacrifice. It would be the most completing moment in Obi-Wan's life to learn that Anakin Skywalker had returned and was responsible for defeating Sidious. On top of that, Boba Fett led a number of rebel craft and engagements with the Empire. His vessel was becoming one of the most feared rebel starships in the galaxy, alongside that of the Ghost. Satine and Obi-Wan would, finally at the end of the war, be able to certify their love openly. At their age, they wouldn't have any kids, but their adopted children would one by one make their way home. Luke and Leia coming home first, with Commander Boba Fett Kryze coming home afterwards. They would all be there for the wedding ceremony. They did make a point to make sure their marriage didn't come off as too informal, or in other words, to make sure they didn't try and overshadow the victory celebration for the galaxy. Satine would commemorate those who fought in the war against the Empire, and she would join figureheads of the Alliance in helping set up the New Republic. Due to how everything went down with Vader, Luke, and Leia, he had about a month's worth of time where he could inform them of the little he knew of Exegol. Vader didn't know about the cloning, but he knew about the planet. They wouldn't need to use the information due to the way that Vader killed his master in the final days of the Empire. The New Republic pushed for a more pacifist direction, but Boba, due to all the time he spent around his beer, decided to become a representative from Mandalore. Satine didn't want to be involved in anything other than Mandalore's politics, but Boba, after fighting for the galaxy, would represent it. His position inside the New Republic would be combining everything Satine, Bo, and Ben taught him, using the best attributes from each to push not just for a better system of government, but one with a military presence. Ben would guide Luke and Leia to rebuilding the Jedi Order on Mandalore, making the whole conflict between Mandalorians and Jedi come full circle. He also did this because he didn't want to leave Satine. They stayed put and continued ruling for years to come. Bo-Katan would have children, but ironically, the heir to the Mandalorian throne came down to Boba, and then after him, the twins, Luke being born first, then Leia. Even though they were adopted, they were family, and they were Clan Kryze. Before Boba left the New Republic, he would marry and eventually have his own children. He stayed put for the longer part of a decade with the new government. During this time, he and a number of other leaders fought an Imperial remnant and crushed what little military it had. When it was said and done, Boba and his love would return to Mandalore and take up the throne that Satine was ready to step down from. As Boba's new heirs were born, the clan continued to grow. There were cousins, nieces, and nephews everywhere. It was a perfect rebirth of a broken family. Luke and Leia would forgo some of the Jedi way due to how open Obi-Wan had become with love and attachments. This led to the two of them having children with their own respective spouses. While Luke and Leia's children would never be up for the role of Duke or Duchess, they would eventually fill out the royal cabinet on Mandalore. This was all a continuation of what Boba and Satine were able to establish, not just with Mandalore but the New Republic. The new era established by the Mandalorians' position in the rebellion aided to the future security of the Republic. Boba's bond with Satine would become the cornerstone and building blocks to the establishment of a new republic that prepared for anything the galaxy might throw at it in this new era of peace. And that, my friends, is a Grand Tier Request story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Jango Fett Clone, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyrmark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandaddy Bane, Laliand, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewo 670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sith Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Gunley 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Force League Star Wars, Airbus, Rex Wolf, Man 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Deadwing for supporting the channel. Smash that like button, go check out the Patreon, cool things on there, new animation just dropped. Otherwise, let's talk about this story. The way the story is brought forward is by a 10-year-old's reaction to the death of his father. In the Clone Wars, we don't see how Aurra Sing and Boss get involved with Boba, but I feel like the crucial moment for Boba is where he decides to go. Him going to Mandalore would be met with hostility. The Mandalorians, as Almec said, wouldn't refer to Jango or Boba as Mandalorians, rather Boba as a clone and Jango as a faker. So I wanted that to feel really present. Also, Jango hated Death Watch, and they didn't like him, so they wouldn't like Boba. The reason Boba goes with Satine is not because she's a pacifist or that she differs from him in any way, but it's the fact that she would be the only ounce of maternal anything he'd ever have. Taun We wasn't maternal, and neither are the Kaminoans, so she'd be the only ounce of substance he had since Jango's death. So I thought it would be interesting for Boba to be a part of this line that contributed to not just the rise of the Alliance, but the rise of the New Republic, and so on and so forth, and being almost instrumental in not just the survival of Mandalore, but the rebirth of the New Republic. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.